Welcome to a special edition of the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me from his headquarters outside Memphis, Tennessee, is my friend Curt Fields. Curt, how are you today?
I'm as fine as frog hair, as they say here in this part of the country where I spend so much time. I'm picking up the expressions. I'm beginning to talk like these folks here.
Now, we're actually recording this on the day after of the big surrender, but you also have a series of grant programs coming up where you will be portraying Ulysses S. Grant. Tell us just a quick second, what's going on in these busy couple days for you?
I'll be, as soon as I give this report to you, I'll be leaving headquarters and going once again to Appomattox Court House, Virginia, the Appomattox Court House National Historical Park. Wonderful place, wonderful staff. And this Saturday and Sunday, General Lee, portrayed by Thomas Jesse, and I will be on the grounds Friday, all day Saturday, and all day Sunday. Saturday night, close to sundown, General Lee and I are going to present our presentation, Appomattox, the last 48 hours, on the porch of the McLean house, where it all came to a conclusion. It's free, and I would urge any who can come to join us Saturday evening and see Appomattox, the last 48 hours. We're going to be about the grounds and talking with people, General Lee and myself individually together, and we're going to recognize the 159th anniversary of the surrender. And I'd like to urge folks to consider coming next April, because it will be the 160th. And I believe the good folks at Appomattox National Historical Park are really going to, as the folks would say, put on the dog for the 160th observation. But I'll be talking today about that surrender process, and I'll be leaving here and going to reenact that surrender process over the next few days. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. And of course, April is also a birthday month for Ulysses S. Grant. You've got some activities going on later in the month associated with that.
The last weekend of April, every last weekend of April, is Grant Days with an exclamation mark for Georgetown, Ohio. And I'm proud to say I am the official grant for the Grant Boyhood Home and sites his one-room schoolhouse where he went for 7 years. The old Dutch Hill School, brick one-room schoolhouse, is open to be toured. His boyhood home is open, two-story boyhood home with two additions. My father built the original house and then expanded it for my mother and expanded it for a second floor, because I've got 5 brothers and sisters and they were coming about every 2 years. But the house has been renovated by the Ohio Historical Connection, and it's a wonderful home to tour. So my school, my boyhood home, and the organization, the U.S. Grant School Boyhood Home and Schoolhouse Historic Sites, really have a celebration. And Saturday night, I will be that weekend, the 28th, I believe, of April. I will be in the Grant Theater, a 1907 theater that was renovated 100 years later. And I will be on stage talking about my boyhood friends, my pets when I was in the White House, and my children and what the 4 of them did into their adult life. Big difference in Georgetown, the last weekend of April.
Sounds like a busy, busy month for you. So safe travels as you head about doing your mission.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So with that, I'll ask you to switch hats and transform, as you so readily do, into Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and its immediate aftermath. General Grant, thanks so much for being with us today.
It is a pleasure, as always, to be with you.
So I understand that you had a very important appointment with General Lee in Appomattox.
I did. On the morning of April 9th, I had no idea that Lee was going to surrender that day. I knew it wouldn't be long, but I had no idea it would be that day. I had I suspect the worst sick headache I had ever had the night of April the 8th. We had stopped at the Crute home farmhouse, very nice 2-story farmhouse called Clifton House, painted all white. And I'd been hit that afternoon with a sick headache, and I was pacing the floor, holding my head and saying, I can't stand the pain. I can't stand the pain. And I got in all that agony. I got a note from General Lee that said, I still don't want to surrender. What would be terms? And I was aggravated to the extreme. And I told Rawlins, my chief of staff, John Rawlins, I shook my head and I said, it looks like Lee means to fight, even at that late hour. And I said, and he wanted to meet me between the lines the next day at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I said, I can't do that. I can't reply to him now. My head hurts too bad. I'm going to answer him in the morning. I tried to sleep. I couldn't sleep. About 4 o'clock in the morning on April the 9th, I got up to go outside in the cool, and it was very cool, foggy. It's been raining off and on all week, frog drowner rain, difficult to move the Army, almost impossible to move caissons, guns, wagons. And I thought if I went outside, the cool air would clear my head. Well, it didn't. And I called my horse, Horace Porter, who had attached himself to my staff. I had attached him, came out and saw me and spoke with me briefly. And I called for Cincinnati, and I was wearing my usual garb, a private's blouse with only shoulder straps, indicate my rank. My trousers were stuffed in my boots. I haven't bathed or changed even my underclothes since I think it was the 4th, and this is now the morning of the 9th. I'm absolutely filthy. My hair is so greasy and dirty, it looks like it's painted on my head. And my head is just pounding. And I'm saying, I can't stand this pain. And so they brought Cincinnati. I didn't have spurs. My hat didn't have hat cords. I don't bother with hat cords. And at that time, I didn't even have spurs. Meade's headquarters is just a few hundred yards away. So we went over. I had a cup of coffee, a couple of cups of hot coffee, trying to wake up and ease my head. Meade is abed. He's got a stomach problem that he's really sick. In fact, he's riding in an ambulance. And I responded to Lee after I'd had a cup of coffee that there's just no need for us to meet. There's no point in it. And I began to move on. Now, I've got a staff of about 12 folks around me. And we began moving toward Appomattox Court House. Now, we've been in pursuit of Lee now it's been about 11 days since March 29th, and now we're up to April the 9th. And it's important, I think, to note, because it seems as I've reviewed it and read accounts, people don't note that I had ordered for the Army to have 12 days of rations. And this is the 12th day. Now, if Lee hadn't surrendered, I was going to have to go into camp and wait for rations to be brought. Now, for the last 3 days, Lee's been doing night marches to stay ahead of me. At first, I need to paint the picture a bit. Lee was trying to punch south and join Joe Johnston in North Carolina. And I anticipated he was going for Danville, which indeed he was. We've already cut railroads, the South Side Railroad, the Danville-Richmond Railroad, and we keep pushing Lee to the west. He's looking to probe south, and he can't do it. Finally, he's gone into Appomattox Court House, Virginia, and he's gone into camp there, I think on the 6th. And we've been exchanging notes, 4 or 5 notes by this time. And I sent that last one to him, said, I'm not going to meet you on the lines today, and began moving. Well, what had happened as I'm moving to the west, Lee had ordered John Gordon that morning at Appomattox Court House to make one final attempt to clear away federal troops and punch south and get into North Carolina. He was expecting to find 8 trains of food and rations at Appomattox Station, which is about 3 miles south of Appomattox Court House. In Virginia, they call so many of those villages courthouses. There was a courthouse and a county seat. And Gordon makes the attempt. Now, Longstreet is to Lee's rear at High Bridge, Virginia, waiting for the word to move forward, and they're going to all pour through the funnel that Gordon has opened. Well, Gordon's men made a valiant attempt, but when there were 15 to 20,000 of our troops straddling that road going into Appomattox Station, Gordon was able to brush aside the cavalry as it's described. I wasn't there, but I'm understanding the cavalry just intentionally gave way because those thousands, 15 to 20,000 troops were across the road, and they knew Gordon wasn't going anywhere. Gordon saw that as the mists lifted. When the battle started, all you could see was muzzle flashes. You see, I want people to understand it's been raining all week, off and on. Mud is knee deep. The weather is cold, almost brutally cold at times. I'm wearing a greatcoat most of the time. In fact, I started out the morning of the 9th wearing a greatcoat. And when the mist lifted, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, Gordon was able to see that legion of troops blocking his way. And he sent back to General Lee back at the apple orchard just outside of Appomattox Courthouse. I can't do this unless General Longstreet can support me heavily. I can do no more. My troops are worn to a frazzle. And Lee at that time knew it's all over. There was no alternative. Now, we had started out 12 days ago with about 125,000 troops. And as we boiled westward across Virginia for the last 12 days, we've had casualties, injuries, sick, and so forth. We've got about 65, 70,000 troops in Ord's Army of the James and Meade's Army of the Potomac. And we've got Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah, which is essentially two cavalry corps. And Sheridan has been our advance. And Sheridan was able, as we're moving, to go a little south and then up to northwest and get in front of Lee, as indeed Ord did. And Lee has no escape. And he said, I understand. He said, although I'd rather die 1,000 deaths, I must go see General Grant. And he went out to the lines, between the lines, and with a white flag. And I'd like people to understand it was nothing but a rag. Because you see, armies don't carry white flags of surrender as routine equipment. So there wasn't anything white. And so Lee goes out with Colonel Marshall and as close as he dared get to federal lines. Federal officers come out and said, what do you want? They didn't know it was Lee until they got to him. The great Robert E. Lee, Mars, is sitting his horse, and they said, I'm expecting to see General Grant. Well, he's not here. Then the message gets to him, there's no need for me to meet you. Well, I understand that's one of the few times that Lee lost his temper. He read the note, crumpled it up, and threw it down. In fact, he hit Colonel Marshall with it when he threw the wadded paper. It unintentionally hit him. And he said, well, take a message. Tell General Grant that I want to meet him for the purposes of the surrender of the Army. Complication here, though, as Lee is sitting his horse waiting. The officer goes back and gets the word to General Meade, who's in an ambulance. He comes back to Lee and said, General, I'm sorry, but you've got to move. And now imagine the consideration and even politeness. This federal officer tells Robert E. Lee, and it was the only time that Robert E. Lee ever appeared under a flag of truce. But he said, General, you've got to move, because General Meade tells me to say to you that he's got orders, and he did, to attack at noon. He said, we've got orders to attack, and I don't have the authority. General Grant has ordered that, and I don't have the authority to countermand that order. And Lee said to tell General Meade, do you not understand what we're doing here? You've got to stop and attack. And so Meade, who thinks it's a ruse, and Sheridan thought it was a ruse, because Meade is on one side of Lee and Ord and Sheridan are on the other side of Lee, and they got him in a vice grip. And I'm 8 or 10 miles, 20 miles away at that time, heading that way, and I don't know all of this is going on yet. So General Lee is waiting, and this officer tells him, General, would you please vacate, because we're going to open fire here shortly, and you need to remove yourself to a place of safety. I think that's admirable. And Lee told Meade through his intermediaries, stall this until we can get word to Grant. So Meade said, I can wait an hour. I'll hold off an hour. And then Lee sends word through Meade's army with the message, I want to surrender. Meade suggested, and he's not being obtuse about this. Meade fully understands what's going on, but he also doesn't want to countermand my order. And he suggested to Lee that he send the same message through Sheridan's lines, Ord's lines. So there's a messenger looking for me through the Army of the Potomac. There's a messenger looking for me through the Army of the James. And nothing comes back to Lee. Nearly an hour or so passes. Lee's getting antsy, and so are the Federals facing him, because the pressure, you must understand, the pressure is getting more and more intense. We've got to do something. We're under orders. Lee's position, you've got to do something. I want to surrender. Stop the killing. So Lee then sends a message. A federal officer is recruited, and I don't know who he was, but he sent through Lee's lines looking for me, so under Confederate escort. So I've got 3 armies looking for me. Now, let's go back to my leaving Curdsville and the Clifton House, the Crute family. I was on Cincinnati, and he's a big fellow. And of course, he's stomping the ground and chuffing and snorting. And Cincinnati seemed to sense something's happening. Actually, more so apparently than I at that particular time. The early morning mist, we rode out of the farmhouse away from the Clifton House, and we're moving across west toward Appomattox Court House, and we ran into part of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, I'd left on the Richmond-Farmville Road. When we hit elements of Lee's army, well, obviously, we've got to move. So we shifted south to the Farmville-Lynchburg Road, and which is another main thoroughfare. Horace Porter made the observation that I think astute. He said, what if Grant had, because he was there, what if Grant had ridden into the Army of Northern Virginia and been captured, and he was Lee's prisoner while Lee is at the other front trying to surrender to Grant. Would that not have been an interesting footnote in history? But we reigned over south of it, which was confusing as it turned out to get to me. It's not like as if the Army didn't know where I was. I wasn't lost, but I had changed my general direction or my specific route, general direction remaining the same. That was what caused the delay in getting Lee's word to me. So their Army of the Potomac, Army of the James, Army of Northern Virginia, all desperately looking to find me. And I'd passed Walker's church. I believe it was a Presbyterian church. We'd passed them, and here comes a rider galloping as much as he could through the mud and hallooing and yelling and waving a paper. It turns out it was Lieutenant Charles Pease, who I should like people to remember, because he's the one that had the honor of actually giving me the note that Lee wanted to surrender. So Lieutenant Pease gallops up, and he forgot himself, and I had to suppress a smile because he's, General, I got it. He was all aflutter, all excited. Lee wants to surrender. Look at this, General. Look at this, General. And I was just looking at him, just gazing at him. And finally, after a minute or so of this erupting excitement, he remembered himself. He calmed down and said, General, I have a message for you. And I nodded to John Rawlins, and I said, give it to him. So Lieutenant Pease gave it to Rawlins, and Rawlins gagged when he read the note. And he handed it to me, and I read it. And then the other fellows read it. It was interesting, I thought, that the anticlimactic note, because one of the officers, I've got, I think, 12 fellows around me. One of the officers said, 3 cheers for the Union. They tried to cheer and nobody could cheer. Wouldn't come. They just, whether it was relief or grief, I don't know. Nobody could cheer. Some of them were crying. So I got off my horse, sat on a rock, and I wrote General Lee this note. General Lee, yours of this morning, 9:30, I believe, 9:30 or 10, is just received by me at 11:50 a.m. I am 4 miles west of Walker's Church, and I will meet you at a place of your choosing to discuss this. And I gave it to Orville Babcock, who took the message. General Babcock took the message to Lee. I want to note that I noted specifically the time that I got that note, 11:50 a.m. And I gave as specifically as I could the time that the location where I was. Now, 4 miles west of Walker's Church, it's 12 miles from Appomattox. So I had an 8-mile ride. But I knew when I saw the note that when General Lee had sent, that he had sent to me, that there was going to be questions. Why did it take 2 hours, the better part of 2 hours, to get to Grant? And I wanted to be specific when I got it and where I was when I got it, to lay aside any rumors about what might have been going on. I had a decision to make. I was, as I had said earlier, I was absolutely filthy. Haven't changed my clothes, not even my underclothes, in 5 days. Or 6, I don't recall. And on the night of April the 5th, Sheridan had sent me a note, I wish you were here. And I left Meade and went to Sheridan. My van is somewhere behind me. I had a decision to make. I could send messengers out and get my van and get a uniform appropriate for the occasion. And I knew not how long that would take. It could take hours a day because I didn't know where my personal van was. And I thought, I've got a situation where I think there were about 15,000 troops actually there with Lee, as I understand it, Appomattox. Now, there were 28,000 ultimately were issued paroles, but they were not all there at that time. They came back to get their paroles because they needed them. But I've got Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a vice grip between Meade and Sheridan or Ord. And they're about 70,000 federal troops. So we've got about 90,000 men. These men, particularly in the ANV, Army of Northern Virginia, are the stalwarts. They have stayed with Lee knowing the cause was lost. And they're standing in between those two armies, looking each way, saying, Yank, if you want some of this, you come right ahead, because we will give you all you want. And the two federal armies, many of those men have been 4-year vets, and they're ready to bring it to an end. And the acrimony is in the air. And all it would take would be one hothead to fire around at somebody on the other side. Somebody could drop a weapon. With 90,000 men, it's possible a weapon could be dropped, and these things are bad about going off. Or it could be a misfire, and the bloodbath would be on. So I decided, rather than wait for my uniform, to ride onto Lee and stop the killing. I sent Babcock ahead, and we got on our horses, and insofar as we could, we began to pound through that Virginia mud. Babcock got back to Lee. He found Lee in an apple orchard. Now, there was a wagon road right beside a tree, and rutted. And Lee is leaning back up against a tree with his legs hanging, as Babcock describes, hanging over into the road. He's talking to Longstreet. Now, Babcock resembles myself. He's got a beard, and he's about my size. So two things happened. First of all, the Confederate soldiers that saw Babcock being escorted to General Lee thought it was me. And they didn't know if the surrender is going on or if I'm surrendering to Lee. Some hopefully were thinking. But the myth that Lee surrendered under an apple tree, that didn't happen. That's just mistaken identity. Also, something else, the myth that Lee was asleep under the apple tree. He was not. He was sitting there conversing with General Longstreet when Babcock was brought up to him. Now, something else that I would like to emphasize, I had told General Lee, I'll meet you at a place of your choosing, time and place. That should be emphasized because I'm the victor in this situation. I could have told General Lee, I will meet you be there. But I gave General Lee the deference and the courtesy of letting him choose location and time. There's no need to beat somebody when they're down. They found the house. I won't go through going through the selection process, but Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall and Babcock talked with Wilmer McLean, and they decided to meet in the McLean house. Babcock had somebody stationed in the road, which to this day is there, the lane that goes past the house, to signal me when I arrived. We got there, as I recall, about 1:30, and I rode up to the knoll. And for those who may enjoy this program, that knoll is still there. As you stand on the front porch of the McLean house and look to your left, the road goes almost a half a mile, gently increasing to a knoll. And you can look into something of a little valley, and the house is down there. I rode up to a group of officers standing there, and I saw Sheridan among them. And of course, Grimsley saddle, it's got that high front. And I leaned on the front of that Grimsley saddle, and I said, "General Sheridan, how are you?" And he said, "I'm fine, General Grant." And I said, "Where is General Lee?" And Sheridan pointed down that road, and he said, "He's there in that farmhouse waiting for you." And I said, "Then I must go see him." And we rode down that short lane, rode into the front yard of the McLean house. We all dismounted. I walked in alone. My staff stayed outside, as they should have, unless invited. Went into the McLean house, stepped in the front parlor, and immediately to the left is a door. There are two doors to that parlor. The rooms in the corridor, there are two rooms. Each has two doors. I stepped to my left. Babcock met me. General Lee stood and walked over. We shook hands. And I'm 5'8". General Lee is, I think, 5'10", 5'11". So he's a bit taller than I am. And he was immaculately dressed. And I want to point this out. He had a brand new uniform of cadet gray, which is a bluish color, light blue. And it had never been worn. It was the only time I noted that he had his general's rank, the stars and the wreath around the stars. It was the only time that Robert E. Lee ever wore a general rank on his uniform. The rest of the war, he'd worn a colonel's rank. But this time he had a general's rank indicated. He had a white shirt that I marveled how in the world he found something that white that late in the war. He had a jeweled scabbard presentation sword that he was wearing, and I looked at that, and I had no sword. I had no spurs, no hat cores on my hat. I'm in a private's blouse, and I'm covered with mud. And we made a little small talk. He said that I remember you, but I couldn't remember your face. We met. I said, "Yes, you were on General Scott's staff, and you come out to my regiment to see us about a business matter of some sort," and we met. He said, I just couldn't remember what you looked like. And we're making a little small talk. And he finally said, "We need to be about business." And he sat down at a square marble top table. And there was an oval, small spool leg table, 4-leg table with a small drawer to it over by the window. And Ely Parker, who is now my staff secretary, Colonel Parker now, because I gave him a rank, brought the table over for me to sit. I was in a small swivel office chair. Lee sat in a tall cane back chair next to the table. And we talked a bit, and he said, "Well, put your terms on paper." And I had no idea what I was going to write until I started writing. Of course, I knew generally what I wanted to say, because back on April the 3rd, when we met at the Thomas Wallace House there in Petersburg, President Lincoln had said, "Let him up easy." And that was my natural inclination anyway. For example, when Petersburg fell on the 2nd, I was urged to attack. And I said, "No, there's no need to attack. Petersburg will fall. And there's no need to waste lives attacking them when they're going to," which indeed that night they evacuated and they were gone. So my natural inclination was to let Lee up easy. And I told him, I wrote 3 paragraphs, but essentially I said, "Make out your roles and lists, lay down your arms, and officers certify the men and so forth. And the wounded cared for, and then they get their paroles." And you see, it was important that they got a parole, because remember, it's an act. These people are in Western Virginia. the war for most of those fellows, well, for all of them, was over, but the war's still going on. There were some, I think, 15 surrenders after Lee surrendered. So Lee's surrender essentially ended the war. Now, those soldiers from all the way as far south as Florida have to get home. The parole was their pass through federal lines. Otherwise, they could be shot or hanged. And they're all unarmed except the officers. They kept their sidearms, and I'll address that and why. But the soldiers needed that parole to prove they could show a federal officer, I have been paroled. Also, it was a ticket that they could ride any military conveyance, train or boat, to the station nearest their home for free. And a lot of that happened. Now, I've also been told, well, it was ignored. I'm sure it was by some particular officers, but on the whole, those Confederate troops that had surrendered had a free ride home insofar as they could ride a train or a boat. And I wanted that emphasized. I also said that the officers could keep their horses, personal baggage, and sidearms. And General Lee said that will have a very happy effect on the men. And I wrote the rest of it and gave it to General Lee. He puts on his glasses and read it. And he said, you left out the word exchanged here, and I'm sure that's what you meant. And I said, yes, it is. He said, well, I'll indicate where it was, and puts a caret there. And I thought, ever the perfectionist. It didn't surprise me with General Lee. I had to suppress a smile. And then when he made that correction in the pencil copy, he said, there's something else I'd like to say. Our men, our Army is different from yours, and the Confederate from the United States Army. And I thought, and later other men who I had brought them in by this time, and they're cycling in and out so everybody could be in the room for a few minutes. But the comment later was that Lee, even to the last minute, was still emphasizing we're two separate countries. And he said, our Army, the men buy their own horses, furnish their own horses. Would you put that in there? And I said, no, sir. You will see that it is not in the terms, and I will not add it. I think I offended General Lee with that because he stiffened a bit and reddened around the neck. And I did not intend to offend. And I leaned over and I said, General, I won't write it in the terms. And my reasoning was, I didn't tell him, but my reasoning was I knew this document was going to be scrutinized and dissected until the last day. And I wanted the utmost economy of verbiage that I could possibly have. I didn't want anything that any lawyer or anybody on either side could argue, well, he really meant this or really meant that. No, sir. I meant what I said. There's no other interpretation possible other than what is on that paper. And I think that I was successful in that. And I didn't want to add horses for me and so forth. So I said, I will instruct my officers that any Confederate soldier or artillerist or cavalryman who says this horse or mule is mine will not be challenged. Because I said, most of your men are farmers, General, and they still got time to get a crop in on their little farms that they're going to go back to. And in order to make it through the winter, they're going to need to get a crop in, and they're going to need their animals. So there'll be no challenge if the man says it's my horse or mule. And he said, he thinly smiled about that time, and he said that will have a happy effect on the men. And so him having agreed to those terms, I gave it to Ted Bowers, Colonel Bowers, to write. Well, he was nervous. His hand was shaky. He said, I can't do this. So I gave it to Ely Parker, who's got a fine hand. Well, when he got ready to write the ink copy, it turned out that we had no ink. And I told General Lee, I find myself embarrassed, General, we have no ink. And General Lee said, I believe Colonel Marshall may have some ink. Marshall reached in his bag, as his soldiers call it, his possibles bag, and he pulls out a bottle of India ink, and we were able to use that. Ely Parker used Colonel Marshall's ink, and we had plenty of paper. So I think it noteworthy to point out that the surrender terms and General Lee's acceptance of those surrender terms were written with Confederate ink on federal paper. There was a true coming together from the paper up. General Lee read the final terms. I think it's 187 words, 185 words, and that's all. General Lee had Colonel Marshall write its acceptance. Lee reviewed it, and his review, his acceptance is, I think, 55 words. So the brevity with which this war came to an end is astounding. And there were triplicate, Ely Parker made triplicate copies. And I gave General Lee a copy of the terms, and General Lee gave us copies, or a copy of his acceptance. We didn't countersign, as is said. I didn't sign his, nor he mine. He got the terms, I got the acceptance. And I believe both those documents are to this day at Appomattox Court House. And we chatted a bit after that. General Lee stood up and he left. Now, I want to emphasize about sidearms. I was excoriated about letting those officers keep their sidearms. You're going to let a bunch of rebs loose in the countryside with guns. What, are you crazy? And so forth. Not at all. You see, what people don't think about is that officers carry pistols, and a symbol of an officer's authority, and a very useful tool, is his sword, because the sword is a big finger. And when the officer raises that sword and points in a direction, it's above the heads of the men, and they can see the officer pointing his saber and know which way to go. Because once the firing starts, there's no voice communication. We're an army that communicates with drums, bugles, and flags, because you're not listening to anything. You can't hear anything. And so you follow which way the flag is pointed. You follow which way the sword is pointed. It's the officer's symbol of authority. Well, in letting the officers keep their sidearms, I let them keep their swords, because it was my intent that not one Confederate officer was going to have to suffer the added insult to grievous injury of surrender, that he's going to have to lean forward on bended knee and give the conquering Yankee his sword to break over his leg. No, sir, that was not necessary. My feeling was, let them keep their pride. I knew that there were going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of mantles all across the South, with the sword proudly hanging over that mantle. And that did not disturb me in the least. Let them keep their pride, because now the war is over and they're our countrymen again. And one does not heal a wound by slapping and beating on it. Let them keep their pride. So that's the significance of letting officers keep their sidearms. And I always like to emphasize that, because it's not written, it's the unwritten in the surrender. Something else I said was that you go home, take your parole, go home to your residence, and obey the laws in force where you live, and you will not be disturbed by the United States government. There are those who say that I far exceeded my authority with that, because what did I do? With that sentence, I sent the entire army of Northern Virginia home. Not one man went to a prison camp. Not one. The officers leading that army were not tried. They were not imprisoned. Everybody went home. And I should think if you check your military history, you're going to find that is without precedent, because that's why General Lee was so dressed. When he was asked, when he left to come meet me, why are you so dressed, General? He was magnificent in his appearance. And he said, I am going to be General Grant's prisoner, and I must look my best. So Lee came to me fully expecting to be placed under arrest. And he left the McLean house a free man to go back to his home. In fact, I wrote a pass for him to go back to Richmond. He left, I think, on the 11th. And he went back because his wife was ailing and Richmond had been partly burned. In fact, Godfrey Weitzel, General Weitzel's troops put out the fires when they went into Richmond that had been set by retreating Confederates. And I let everybody go on parole. President Lincoln accepted that and congratulated me. Congress accepted it. So the entire Army of Northern Virginia went home. It's over. Lay down your weapons and go home. So as Lee is writing his or reviewing his acceptance, I was looking at him and thinking, I can't tell if you're relieved because it's over or if you're sad because you've lost. My headache, that migraine headache that I've been suffering from all day on the 8th and into the morning of the 9th, had completely gone away when I got the note from Lee that he wanted to surrender. And I was exultant when I got that news, and expected to be so when I met with Lee. But instead, when Lee was there, I was filled with melancholy. I was sorry for Lee and sorry for his army, because they had fought valiantly for 4 years for a cause that they believed in. Although now I felt it, still feel it, to be the worst cause for which a country ever went to war. But I understood soldiers fighting for what they believed in, and they were tasting a mouthful of gall because they lost. And I was sorry for them and how they felt. You may search your military history, and you're not going to find an army like the Army of Northern Virginia who did more with less, better, longer than any other army in history. And yet they had been defeated. And that's not to praise them so much as it is to praise their foe that defeated them and brought them to bay, the Federal soldier. But I couldn't fathom how Lee felt. He got the marble man image justifiably. He was impassive. And he went out on the front porch, travelers brought around. The only outward display of any angst or feeling was he smacked. He had long buckskin gauntlets, light gray buckskin gauntlets, and he pulled them on while he's waiting for the private to bring Traveler around, and he smacked his hands 3 times like this as he's waiting for Traveler. He said nothing. He mounted Traveler. As he turned around, I lifted my hat. And when I did that, all my staff lifted their hats. Lee lifted his hat, reined Traveler about, and went back to his camp to tell his troops that he'd surrendered. Those that keep track of such things tell me that we spent 78 minutes in the McLean house. And I want to talk about the sword. The myth is that General Lee offered me a sword and I gallantly refused it. That's pure bunkum. Lee never mentioned the sword. Now, it was a magnificent sword, jeweled. It was thought that ladies in England had given it to him, but it was a doctor in Baltimore that had ordered it and given it to him. But he never mentioned the sword. And I was desperately hoping that he was not going to mention the sword. Only mention of a sword was when I came in and met him. And I said, I don't have my sword, General. I do not generally wear a sword. I don't like to wear a sword. It just bruises my leg and bothers the horse. I don't wear a sword, so I didn't have one with me, and I apologize for not having a sword. And that's all that was said about my attire or sword. Lee never mentioned his sword. He never offered, and I didn't refuse. That's just romance. And he went back to his men. An end note for this, I appointed Gibbon and Griffin, don't recall the other general, Longstreet, for the three commissioners to work out the paperwork. Longstreet and Gordon, and I don't recall the third Confederate, but they worked out, those 6 men worked out the particulars about stacking and parking and so forth. The next day, on the morning of the 10th, I took a notion that I'd ride out and meet with General Lee to make one more attempt to get him to order everyone to lay down their arms, because in the last month or so, he had been named General in Chief, counter to equivalent to my own rank. And I rode out to him with the staff, and I caught him unawares. He did not expect to see me again. He was in his waistcoat having some morning coffee, and they came running up to him and said, General Grant's approaching. And General Lee put on a great coat, and he was on Traveler, and we moved a bit away from my staff and the men around him. And we talked, had a congenial conversation for about 20 minutes or so. And I tried to prevail upon him to order all Confederate armies to lay down their arms. And he demurred and said, well, I can't do that, General Grant. I don't have that authority. And I thought, yes, you do. But I saw that Lee had made up his mind, and there was going to be no changing his mind. He did say, General Grant, the South is a large place. I expect you're going to have to march over it 2 or maybe 3 times before you conquer it. And I said, that may be so, General. That may be so. Hopefully not. I bid him good day, and I rode back to my headquarters, which was on the other side of the McLean house across the road, and prepared to go back to Washington City, because being an old quartermaster, I knew that there were millions of dollars a day being spent on Army contracts. And yes, my mind immediately went back to the practicality of the issue. Let's stop those federal contracts. And I sent a note to Secretary Stanton, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to me this day, and so forth. So on the 9th. And I entrained on the 10th to go back to Washington City. General Lee left and went back to Richmond with my pass to go through the lines with the orders, do not disturb this man. And I think I should bring it to a close with that. I'm on the way back to Washington City. Lee's on the way back to Richmond. And Sherman is going to be meeting with Joe Johnston. And that's what happened with that surrender is another story for another day.
Well, General Grant, I really appreciate the chance to hear your perspective on what happened on that fateful day in Appomattox. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us today.
Always a pleasure, Ms. Mackowski. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Curt Fields, thanks for being with us today. I'm Chris Mackowski. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.